It took exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds for Tulsi Gabbard to snap at a Republican senator from her own party, the same party she had joined just months earlier to prove her loyalty to Donald Trump. Senator Jerry Moran had asked a simple question, a question that should have been the easiest softball of the entire confirmation hearing. Instead, Gabbard's response would become the most damaging, unforced error of her nomination, a moment that revealed everything her critics had warned about. What made those 3 seconds even more devastating was what Jerry Moran was dealing with that morning. Just 12 hours earlier, 64 people from his home state of Kansas had died in the worst aviation disaster in America in over 2 decades. A plane from Wichita had collided with a military helicopter over the Potomac River. Moran had spent the night fielding calls from grieving families, coordinating with emergency responders, and preparing statements for a state in mourning. And when he came to the hearing room that morning, exhausted and heartbroken, carrying the weight of 64 souls from Kansas, Tulsi Gabbard looked him in the eye and told him she was offended by his question. But to understand how devastating those 3 seconds truly were, you have to understand what Jerry Moran was carrying into that hearing room. You have to understand what had happened the night before, what was happening at that very moment in the icy waters of the Potomac, and why a Kansas senator asking about Russia carried weight that went far beyond partisan politics. January 29th, 2025, 8:47 p.m. Eastern Time. A Bombardier CRJ-700 regional jet, operating as American Eagle Flight 5342, was on final approach to Reagan National Airport. The flight had originated in Wichita, Kansas, carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members home to Washington. Among them were figure skating champions, teenagers with Olympic dreams, coaches who had dedicated their lives to the sport, and families who had traveled to watch their children compete at the National Development Camp. In the control tower, an air traffic controller who was handling work normally assigned to 2 people issued a warning to an Army Black Hawk helicopter that was also in the vicinity. "Pat 25, do you have the CRJ in sight?" The controller asked if the helicopter crew could see the approaching passenger jet. Seconds later, another call. "Pat 25, pass behind the CRJ." There was no response, at least none that prevented what happened next. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the helicopter and the passenger jet collided at approximately 300 feet above the Potomac River, roughly half a mile from the runway threshold. The impact created a flash visible from the Kennedy Center's webcam, a brief moment of light that would be replayed millions of times in the days to come. Both aircraft plunged into the dark, frigid waters of the Potomac. The plane broke into 3 sections. The helicopter sank nearby. Within minutes, rescue boats from multiple agencies were racing toward the crash site, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, their crews knowing that the water temperature made survival almost impossible. There were no survivors. All 67 people aboard both aircraft, 64 on the plane and 3 soldiers on the helicopter, died in what would become the deadliest aviation disaster in America since 2001. And the plane had come from Wichita, Kansas, Jerry Moran's state, January 30th, 2025, Senate Intelligence Committee Hearing Room 216 in the Dirksen Building. The atmosphere was heavy with tragedy that could not be separated from the confirmation hearing scheduled for that day. News of the Potomac River crash had dominated every screen in America since the previous night. Footage of rescue boats searching dark waters, of wreckage floating near Reagan National Airport, of families gathering at Wichita's Eisenhower Airport, waiting for news that would never come. The flight had been American Eagle 5342, a regional jet carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members from Wichita to Washington. Among the dead were 14 figure skaters, returning from a national development camp, their coaches, their parents. Russian world champions Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, who had made America their home, were among the victims. So were teenagers with Olympic dreams, mothers who had traveled to watch their children compete, flight attendants who had spent years making passengers feel welcome. It was the deadliest aviation disaster in America since 2001, and it had originated in Wichita, Kansas, the heart of Jerry Moran's state. Moran had been Kansas's senior senator since 2011, a lawyer from the small town of Plainville, population around 1,500. He had spent his entire career representing the farmers, ranchers, and small business owners of the American heartland. He had served 7 terms in the House of Representatives before moving to the Senate, where he had made veterans' issues and agricultural policy his specialties. He served on the Senate Intelligence Committee, where national security was his daily concern. He was a Republican's Republican, conservative on spending, strong on defense, skeptical of foreign adversaries. His reputation in the Senate was as a workhorse rather than a show horse. He wasn't known for grandstanding or viral moments. He was known for showing up, doing the work, and asking substantive questions that cut through political theater. Colleagues from both parties respected him as someone who took national security seriously, who didn't play games with classified information, who understood that some issues transcended partisan politics. He was also, in the Kansas tradition, unfailingly polite. Even when asking tough questions, Moran maintained the courteous demeanor that Midwesterners consider essential to civilized discourse. He didn't attack. He didn't grandstand. He asked questions in a way that gave witnesses every opportunity to provide reasonable answers. This was the Senator Tulsi Gabbard was about to tell she was offended. But on the morning of January 30th, Jerry Moran was also something else. He was a Kansan in mourning, representing a state that had just lost 64 of its own in the most horrifying way imaginable. He had spent the night fielding calls from grieving families, coordinating with state officials, preparing statements that would somehow make sense of a tragedy that made no sense at all. The hearing was supposed to focus on Tulsi Gabbard's fitness to serve as Director of National Intelligence. For weeks, senators from both parties had expressed concerns about her past statements, praising Edward Snowden, her skepticism of American intelligence assessments, her meeting with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, and most troubling to many, her repeated echoing of Russian propaganda about Ukraine. Gabbard had anticipated some of these attacks. In her opening statement, she had attempted a preemptive defense that would later seem almost comically ill-advised, given what was to come. "Before I close, I want to warn the American people who are watching at home," she had said, her voice carrying a note of defiance. "You may hear lies and smears in this hearing that will challenge my loyalty to and my love for our country. Those who oppose my nomination imply that I am loyal to something or someone other than God, my own conscience, and the Constitution of the United States." And then she had listed them, every accusation, every foreign leader she had been accused of serving, accusing me of being Trump's puppet, Putin's puppet, Assad's puppet, a guru's puppet, Modi's puppet, she said, not recognizing the absurdity of simultaneously being the puppet of 5 different puppet masters. It was meant to be a clever dismissal of her critics. Instead, it had the effect of reminding everyone in the room of exactly how many foreign connections had been questioned over the years. Nobody had accused her of being all 5 puppets simultaneously. By listing them all together, she had created a catalog of concerns that might not have occurred to some observers until she mentioned them. "The fact is, what truly unsettles my political opponents is I refuse to be their puppet," she had concluded. "I have no love for Assad or Gaddafi or any dictator. I just hate Al-Qaeda." The "I just hate Al-Qaeda" line would become its own subject of analysis. It seemed to suggest that her Syria positions, including her meeting with Assad and her skepticism of chemical weapons evidence, were motivated purely by opposition to terrorist groups rather than any sympathy for dictators. But critics noted that hating al-Qaeda was not a particularly distinguishing characteristic. Everyone hated al-Qaeda. The question was whether Gabbard's hatred of al-Qaeda had led her to minimize or excuse the crimes of dictators who also opposed al-Qaeda. Gabbard had spent years making statements that aligned perfectly with Kremlin talking points. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, she had blamed NATO expansion rather than Russian aggression. This war and suffering could have easily been avoided if Biden admin/NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns, she had written on social media at the start of the invasion. She had questioned whether Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people, despite overwhelming evidence from American, French, and international investigators. She had relied on sources who appeared on Russian state television, who consulted with Assad regime defenders, who had been repeatedly debunked by weapons experts. Senator Mark Kelly had spent significant time in the hearing exposing exactly how compromised her sources had been. She had called Snowden a brave whistleblower and introduced legislation to drop all charges against him, legislation she had co-sponsored with Matt Gaetz. When senators asked her if Snowden was a traitor, she refused to say yes over and over again, until Senator Michael Bennet finally snapped at her. Apparently, you don't understand how critical our national security is. Russian state media had noticed her positions. They praised her regularly, amplified her statements, treated her as a useful voice in American politics. RT and Sputnik, the Kremlin's English-language propaganda outlets, featured her comments prominently whenever she criticized American foreign policy. Whether Gabbard intended this or not, the result was undeniable. When she spoke about Russia, she sounded like Russia wanted her to sound. Former Senator Mitt Romney had been even more direct. In 2022, he had accused her of spreading treasonous lies about the Ukraine war that may well cost lives. The accusation had been controversial at the time, dismissed by some as partisan overreach, but the pattern of statements that prompted it was well documented. This was the concern Jerry Moran brought to the hearing room that morning, not as a political attack, not as partisan warfare, but as a genuine question from a member of the Intelligence Committee who needed to know whether the woman seeking to oversee America's spy agencies could be trusted to view Russia clearly. The hearing had already been contentious before Moran's turn arrived. Democratic senators had pressed Gabbard repeatedly on Snowden, on Assad, on her past opposition to surveillance programs she now claimed to support. Republican senators had asked friendlier questions, but even some of them seemed uncomfortable with her answers. Senator James Lankford had asked if Snowden was a traitor. Gabbard refused to say yes. Senator Susan Collins had pressed on whether she would support a pardon. Gabbard gave hedging, qualified answers that satisfied no one. The Snowden questioning had been particularly brutal. Lankford, an Oklahoma Republican who had been expected to support Gabbard, had grown visibly frustrated as she repeatedly dodged his straightforward question. "Is Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America?" he had asked. Gabbard responded that Snowden had broken the law, but also exposed egregious, illegal, and unconstitutional programs. Lankford pressed again and again. Each time, Gabbard found new ways to avoid the word traitor. Senator Todd Young, an Indiana Republican and former Marine intelligence officer, had taken a different approach. He had pulled up his phone and read aloud a tweet that Snowden had posted just hours before the hearing. "Tulsi Gabbard will be required to disown all prior support for whistleblowers as a condition of confirmation today. Snowden had written from his exile in Russia. I encourage her to do so. Young looked at Gabbard and asked how she thought intelligence professionals would receive her, given her years of defending a man they considered a traitor. Gabbard had no good answer. Senator Mark Kelly, the Arizona Democrat and former astronaut, had delivered perhaps the most devastating substantive questioning of the day. He had systematically exposed how Gabbard had relied on a discredited MIT professor who appeared on Russian state television and consulted with Assad regime defenders to question American intelligence assessments about chemical weapons. Do you consider this person a better source for the chemistry of sarin gas than the United States intelligence community? Kelly had asked. Gabbard had sat in silence for 8 seconds before finally admitting she hadn't known about her source's Russian media appearances. Senator Michael Bennet, the Colorado Democrat, had grown so frustrated with Gabbard's evasions on Snowden that he had snapped at her in a moment that went viral. I understand how critical our national security is, Gabbard had said. Apparently you don't, Bennet had shot back. Apparently you don't. By the time Moran's questioning period arrived, the hearing room had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Gabbard was clearly prepared for hostile questions from Democrats. What she seemed unprepared for was skepticism from Republicans. And Jerry Moran, whatever his personal feelings about the tragedy unfolding in his state, was about to ask the kind of question that should have been easy. Moran began his questioning with characteristic Midwestern politeness. He acknowledged the complexity of the issues at hand. He noted the importance of the position Gabbard was seeking. And then he got to the point. I want to make certain, Moran said, his voice carrying the weariness of a sleepless night and the weight of tragedy, that in no way does Russia get a pass in either your mind or your heart, or in any policy, recommendation you would make or not make. It was, by any objective measure, a softball question, a chance for Gabbard to distance herself from years of statements that had aligned with Russian interests, a chance to reassure a Republican senator that she understood the threat Russia posed to American security, a chance to demonstrate the judgment and temperament expected of someone seeking to lead the intelligence community. All she had to say was some version of, "Absolutely not, Senator. Russia is a strategic adversary that poses serious threats to American interests, and I will treat them accordingly." Instead, something else happened. Something that would be replayed on cable news for days, analyzed by political commentators, and cited by senators explaining their concerns about her nomination. Gabbard's expression shifted. Her posture changed, and in a tone that mixed indignation with aggression, she responded, "Senator, I'm offended by the question." 3 words, 3 seconds, and in that moment, everything changed. The hearing room fell silent. Reporters in the press gallery exchanged glances. Senate staffers who had been taking routine notes looked up from their papers. Even other committee members seemed surprised by the sharpness of Gabbard's response. She continued, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present in her earlier testimony. Because my sole focus, commitment, and responsibility is about our own nation, our own security, and the interests of the American people. She paused, perhaps realizing that her response had landed differently than intended. She added, in a slightly softer tone, "No country, group, or individual will get a pass in carrying out the responsibilities of the Director of National Intelligence, if confirmed, providing that full intelligence picture so that you all can make the best informed policy decisions for the safety, security, and freedom of the American people." It was a recovery attempt, but the damage was done. The word that would define the exchange wasn't anything in her second statement. It was one word from her first response. Offended. Tulsi Gabbard, seeking confirmation to the most sensitive intelligence position in the American government, had just told a grieving Republican senator from her own party that she was offended by a question about whether Russia would get favorable treatment. The political implications were immediate and devastating. Within minutes, the exchange was being shared across social media. Within hours, it had become the defining moment of the hearing, overshadowing even the contentious Snowden questioning that had preceded it. But what made the moment truly damaging wasn't just the word itself. It was the context that surrounded it. Jerry Moran was not a hostile questioner looking to score political points. He was a conservative Republican who had served on the Intelligence Committee for years, who understood national security threats, who had every reason to want a Trump nominee to succeed. He was also, on that particular morning, a man whose state had just suffered an unspeakable tragedy. Senate aides who witnessed the exchange later described it as bizarre and self-destructive. One Republican staffer told reporters that committee members and staff thought Gabbard had done a poor job overall, making multiple unforced errors. But this exchange with Moran stood out above all the others. They thought she was overly combative with what were softball questions from Republicans, the aide said. The day after he's facing a tragedy in his own state, that she'd snap at him for no reason was bizarre. She's a skilled communicator, and people had a high expectation for what her performance would be. The tragedy connection wasn't lost on observers. American Eagle Flight 5342 had been carrying Kansans home from Washington. Figure skating families who had traveled to the National Development Camp in Wichita were among the dead. The flight route itself, Wichita to Reagan National, had only been established the previous year after years of effort by Kansas officials to connect their state to the nation's capital. Now 64 people from that flight were dead, their bodies being recovered from the icy Potomac River, even as Gabbard sat in the hearing room telling the senior senator from Kansas that she was offended by his question about Russia. The juxtaposition was impossible to ignore. Moran had every reason to skip the hearing entirely, to focus on the tragedy unfolding in his state, to be with the grieving families who were looking to him for leadership. Instead, he had come to fulfill his constitutional duty, to evaluate a nominee for one of the most important positions in national security, and Gabbard had responded by telling him she was offended. The aftermath extended far beyond the hearing room. Conservative media, which had generally defended Gabbard as an anti-establishment voice being unfairly attacked, found itself unable to spin this moment. Fox News hosts who had praised her independence now had to explain why she had snapped at a Republican senator asking a reasonable question. MAGA influencers who had celebrated her as a Trump loyalist had to reckon with footage showing her alienating potential Republican votes. Tucker Carlson, who had previously championed Gabbard as exactly the kind of unconventional thinker Washington needed, fell notably silent about the exchange. Sean Hannity, who had hosted her multiple times as a voice of reason against the Democratic establishment, didn't replay the clip. Even the most loyal Trump media allies understood that this moment could not be defended. On social media, the clip spread with devastating speed. Conservative accounts that had been attacking Democrats for questioning Gabbard's patriotism suddenly had to watch their nominee telling a Republican she was offended by questions about Russia. Liberal accounts gleefully amplified the moment, noting that this was exactly what they had warned about. But the most damaging reactions came from within the Senate itself. Republican staffers, speaking anonymously to multiple outlets, expressed shock at Gabbard's miscalculation. They had expected her to struggle with Democratic questions. They had prepared for hostile exchanges about Snowden and Assad and chemical weapons. What they hadn't prepared for was their nominee creating problems with Republican senators. One aide to a Republican committee member told The Hill, "We thought she was a skilled communicator. We thought she'd handle the softball questions easily and fight through the hard ones. Instead, she fought through the softballs and created her own hard questions." Another staffer was blunter. "You don't snap at a senator whose state just lost 64 people in a plane crash. You just don't. Even if you think the question is unfair, which it wasn't. You show some basic human decency." She couldn't even manage that. Democratic critics, meanwhile, seized on the exchange as confirmation of everything they had warned about. If Gabbard couldn't handle a softball question from a friendly Republican without becoming defensive and combative, how would she handle the pressure of briefing the president on genuine national security crises? If her instinct when asked about Russia was to express offense rather than clarity, what did that reveal about her judgment? The psychological analysis was equally damaging. Political observers noted that innocent people don't typically respond to routine questions with offense. When someone asks if you can be fair and impartial, the natural response is to affirm that you can, not to express indignation at the question. Gabbard's reaction suggested, at minimum, a sensitivity about Russia that raised more questions than it answered. Senator Mark Warner, the committee's ranking Democrat, had already expressed concerns about Gabbard's judgment. The Moran exchange gave those concerns concrete form. Here was a nominee who couldn't maintain composure when asked a basic question by a member of her own party on a day when that member was dealing with the worst tragedy his state had experienced in decades. The timing made everything worse. If Gabbard had shown this temperament on an ordinary day, it would have been concerning. But she showed it on a day when empathy and restraint should have been automatic. She showed it to a man who had spent the previous night learning that 64 of his constituents had died in a plane crash. She showed it in response to a question that any competent political operator would have recognized as an easy opportunity to reassure skeptics. Instead, she chose offense. The ripple effects continued for days. Republican senators who had been inclined to support Gabbard began expressing private concerns. Staff members who had expected her to sail through confirmation started preparing contingency talking points. White House officials who had dismissed concerns about her nomination suddenly found themselves dealing with a candidate who had created her own problems. One senior GOP aide summarized the situation bluntly. "She came in with baggage, and instead of lightening the load, she added to it. The Moran thing especially hurt because he wasn't trying to trap her. He was giving her a chance to clean up her Russia record, and she threw it back in his face." The contrast with other Trump nominees was stark. Pete Hegseth, facing serious allegations about his personal conduct, had maintained composure and expressed humility throughout his confirmation process. Kash Patel, despite his controversial history, had handled hostile questions without becoming visibly angry. Even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., facing bipartisan skepticism about his health views, had managed to seem reasonable under pressure. Gabbard, alone among Trump's major nominees, had let her mask slip in front of the cameras. And she had done it not in response to a Democratic attack, but to a Republican's gentle inquiry. The figure skating connection added another layer of tragedy to the moment. Among the 67 people killed in the Potomac crash were world champion pairs, skaters, Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, Russian nationals who had made America their home and coached American champions. Their deaths, along with those of young American skaters with Olympic dreams, had devastated the international skating community. These were people who had fled Russia to build lives in America, who had dedicated themselves to training the next generation of American athletes. They died on a flight from Kansas, represented by Jerry Moran. On the same day, Tulsi Gabbard told Moran she was offended by questions about whether Russia would get favorable treatment. The symbolism was almost too heavy to bear. Russian emigrants who had chosen America, killed alongside American children with dreams of representing their country, while a nominee for Director of National Intelligence bristled at questions about her Russia posture. What should have been a routine confirmation hearing had become something else entirely, a collision of tragedy and temperament, of national mourning and personal defensiveness, of softball questions and inexplicable offense. In the days following the hearing, analysis focused on whether Gabbard could recover. Some observers believed the Snowden questioning had been more substantively damaging, that her refusal to call him a traitor was the real problem. Others pointed to Senator Mark Kelly's systematic exposure of her reliance on Russian propaganda sources as the most devastating exchange. But for pure political damage, for the moment that crystallized concerns about her judgment and temperament, nothing matched those 3 seconds with Jerry Moran. "Senator, I'm offended by the question." It wasn't what she said after that mattered. It wasn't her clarification about no country getting a pass. It wasn't her commitment to American security. It was that initial, instinctive response that revealed something about how she processed questions about Russia. Normal nominees, when asked if they can be fair toward an adversary, respond with reassurance. They understand that the question is an opportunity, not an attack. They recognize that skepticism about their record is natural and that addressing it directly serves their interests. Gabbard responded with offense, and in doing so, she confirmed the very concerns that had prompted the question. The vote eventually came. The Senate Intelligence Committee advanced her nomination 9-8 along party lines, with Republican senators who had expressed concerns ultimately falling in line with their party. Susan Collins, who had grilled Gabbard about Snowden and surveillance, voted yes. Todd Young, who had read Snowden's tweets aloud during the hearing, voted yes. Even Moran, despite the exchange that had defined the day, voted to advance her nomination. The pressure from the White House had been intense. Vice President J.D. Vance had publicly warned that opposing Trump's nominees was equivalent to rejecting the voters who elected him. Conservative media figures had targeted wavering Republicans with campaigns questioning their loyalty. The message was clear: fall in line or face consequences. The full Senate confirmed her 52-48, with Mitch McConnell casting the lone Republican no vote. McConnell, the former Republican leader who had spent his career in national security and intelligence matters, could not bring himself to support a nominee whose Russia record troubled him so deeply. His no vote was a quiet rebuke, a statement from the party's institutional wing that not everyone had forgotten the concerns that had been raised. Gabbard became Director of National Intelligence, the woman responsible for briefing the president on threats to American security, for coordinating 18 intelligence agencies, for protecting the nation's most sensitive secrets. But those who watched the hearing would never forget the moment when a grieving senator asked a simple question, and the nominee responded with offense. In the months that followed, questions about Gabbard's Russia posture would continue to surface. Intelligence professionals who worked with her would express private concerns about her approach to analysis involving Russia. Foreign allies would wonder whether sensitive intelligence shared with America would be handled with appropriate skepticism toward Russian disinformation. Some said the Moran exchange revealed her true feelings about Russia. Others said it showed a lack of political judgment that would haunt her tenure. Still others believed it demonstrated a temperament unsuited for the pressures of intelligence leadership, a tendency to become defensive and combative when questions touched on sensitive areas. But everyone agreed on one thing. In those 3 seconds, Tulsi Gabbard had shown the nation something she probably wished she had kept hidden, a flash of defensiveness about Russia that no amount of subsequent reassurance could erase. The question Jerry Moran asked was simple: would Russia get a pass? Her answer should have been simpler. No. Instead, she chose offense. And 64 families in Kansas, grieving the loss of loved ones in the Potomac River, watched as their senator was told that his question was offensive. Sometimes the most revealing moments in a confirmation hearing aren't the long exchanges or the detailed policy discussions. Sometimes they're the brief flashes of instinct, the unguarded reactions that show who a person really is when the pressure rises. Jerry Moran asked if Russia would get a pass. Tulsi Gabbard said she was offended, and in 3 seconds, she told America everything it needed to know. The victims of American Eagle Flight 5342 deserved better. The figure skaters with Olympic dreams, the coaches who had dedicated their lives to the sport, the families who had traveled to watch their children compete. They all deserved better. Jerry Moran, carrying their memory into that hearing room, deserved better. And America, seeking a director of national intelligence who could view Russia with clear eyes, deserved better. But in that moment, offense was all Tulsi Gabbard had to offer. 3 seconds, 1 word, and a confirmation that every concern about her judgment had been justified. She won the vote. She got the job. But she never escaped those 3 seconds. Senator, I'm offended by the question. The question was whether Russia would get a pass, and somehow that question was offensive. In Washington, they say that confirmation hearings reveal character under pressure. What pressure reveals, preparation cannot hide. Tulsi Gabbard had prepared for hostile Democrats and friendly Republicans. She had prepared for questions about Snowden and Assad and chemical weapons. What she hadn't prepared for was a moment when her instincts would betray her, when a simple question would trigger a response that revealed more than any policy discussion ever could. Jerry Moran's question revealed nothing about him. It was a straightforward inquiry that any competent nominee should have welcomed. It was, as one Republican staffer later described it, the softest of softballs. Tulsi Gabbard's answer revealed everything about her, and 64 souls from Kansas, lost in the dark waters of the Potomac, became the tragic backdrop to a moment that should never have happened. The senator asked a simple question. The nominee chose offense, and America watched and remembered and understood. In the end, the exchange lasted only 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds will define Tulsi Gabbard's legacy more than any policy decision, any intelligence briefing, any bureaucratic reorganization. They captured something essential about who she was and how she processed questions about Russia. Jerry Moran went back to Kansas to comfort grieving families and attend memorial services. He helped coordinate the federal response to the crash investigation. He did what senators do when tragedy strikes their states, which is show up and serve. Tulsi Gabbard went to the office of the Director of National Intelligence, where she assumed responsibility for America's most sensitive secrets. She began briefing the president on threats from around the world, including threats from Russia. But somewhere in those briefings, in those intelligence assessments, in those daily decisions about what to tell the president and what to withhold, the ghost of those 3 seconds lingered. Senator, I'm offended by the question. The question was whether Russia would get a pass, and Tulsi Gabbard's answer, instinctive and unguarded, was that she found the question offensive. 3 seconds, 67 victims, 1 moment of truth, and a nation left wondering whether the woman who controls its secrets can see its adversaries clearly. The hearing ended. The votes were cast. The confirmation was secured. But the question remained. Will Russia get a pass? Tulsi Gabbard said she was offended by the question, and that was the only answer America ever needed.